Okay, trying this again. I had some problems with the Google Plus account and YouTube channel a little bit ago. Hopefully this time it will work okay and the internet connection will not reset and I'll be able to record this lecture. I want to talk today on the limits of concepts and conceptual abilities and of consciousness, since this is a course on consciousness in the brain. I'm going to be talking from a primarily philosophical perspective, but hopefully with due insights from neuroscience. This talk was originally presented at the Board Science of Consciousness conference in Stockholm in May of 2011. I will be giving a presentation at the Tour de Science of Consciousness conference in Helsinki in, I believe, June of this year. That talk will be on free will. I will be presenting what I hope is a distinctive argument in favor of a libertarian and incompatibilist account of free will. But for today, as I said, I want to be talking about the limits of concept and of consciousness. I see the two as being deeply intertwined with each other, so that most, if not all, major theories of consciousness, except for the reductive or eliminativist accounts, implicitly, I believe, assume a tight connection between consciousness. They just don't make that commitment explicit. So I would like to make that explicit here. The hallmark of both consciousness and of conceptually structured thought is a certain flexibility in response to one's environment, presented with what are more or less the same circumstances on different occasions. The conceptual agent, the conscious agent, is able to choose differently on different occasions based on a weighted consideration of past experiences and an expectation of experiences to come. So what both concepts and consciousness give us is an ability to make a range of choices that we cannot make otherwise. Indeed, I look at concept and consciousness myself as being two sides of a single coin. Most of what I say today is going to be addressing concepts and conceptual abilities, but it should be taken to apply by close extension to consciousness as well, starting assumptions. I want to begin today with a quote from the economist Hayek. Hayek was indeed primarily an economist, but he did write in philosophy of mind as well. This quote comes from a book of his called The Sensory Order, where he writes that because of constitutional limitations of our mind, we shall never be able to achieve more than an explanation of the principle on which mind operates, and shall never succeed in fully explaining any particular mental act. That is roughly the position that I'm going to take today as well. So I believe that we can understand a great deal about consciousness. We can understand a great deal more about consciousness than we do today. But what we cannot do is provide a complete and consistent account of consciousness, because that outstrips our conceptual capacities and would indeed require us to be able to side our consciousness, to somehow view it from the outside in a strictly objective manner, which is, I believe, not possible. So my favorite when it comes to talking about both concepts and consciousness is the Sufi tale of the blind men and the elephant. A group of men who are blind from birth are examining an elephant, and one of them says, an elephant is like a solid wall of leather. Another says, no, 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 no. An elephant is like a tree trunk. I can't get my arm around it. The third one says, you're both wrong. It's like a rope. Yeah, it's very flexible. I can pull on it. And the fourth one says, you're all crazy. An elephant is sharp and pointed and hard like rock. And of course, all of the blind people are right, and all of them are wrong because they're only seeing parts of the entire picture. They can't see the entire picture, and they don't know, they don't have any way to control all of their individual little pictures. So I think it's very much like that with the nature of conceptually structured thought or of consciousness. These are multidimensional entities that we cannot fit entirely into our self-conscious thought at any one time. So we focus on one or another aspect to the exclusion of the others, and we think that we are talking about different things when we're actually talking about different aspects of the same thing. So we've attempted over the last few weeks to define what consciousness is. I want to define for you today what concepts are. And again, I think of concepts and consciousness rather like two sides of a single coin. Concepts are, as I wish to describe them, the building blocks of structured thought, or if you will, the ability or the abilities by which we think in a systematically and productively structured fashion. What do I mean when I say that concepts are systematic? We can take the same concepts and we can apply them across unbounded many different contexts in a systematic fashion. We can apply them in more or less the same way across each context. What do I mean when I say that concepts are productive? I mean that we can take a finite number of concepts and we can combine them and recombine them into complex concepts and propositions ad infinitum. Concepts are intentional in the sense of being about something other than themselves. In the same way that the consciousness is intentional, it's directed towards something. And concepts are intentional for an agent in the same way that consciousness is intentional for an agent. They're not free-floating things. So there is always an agent who possesses the concept, and there is always something that the concept is directed for. The same may be said for consciousness. Experience gives rise to our concepts, which in turn give rise to our experience in a circular causal fashion, such that we cannot stop the circle at that point and say where our concept or where our experience begin. Concepts give us experience, experience gives us concepts, our structure our experience provides us our concepts. So the main thesis that I want to argue for today are that we have a certain conceptual blindness, if you will, when it comes to the nature of our conceptually structured thought, or when it comes to the nature of our consciousness. And that is an inability to set aside either our conceptual nature or our consciousness for a moment to see them as they actually are, whatever that might actually mean. So theories of concepts and theories of consciousness are best approached pragmatically, I believe, with no one correct answer. And indeed, I think there will be different appropriate answers depending on the questions that we're asking at the given time, depending on the application that we wish to put the questions to. Now, unlike Daniel Dennett, or even more so, the Churchlands, I believe that the consciousness is not an illusion. I think consciousness is a very real thing. Unlike someone like Matri, I believe that concepts are a very real thing as well. But even as I don't think that concepts are themselves fictional, I think they present us with what I like to call a necessary fiction. I think something very much like this can be said for consciousness as well. So what do I mean when I say that concepts are a necessary fiction? I mean that they simplify the world for us in order to make it comprehensible. They distort the world that we encounter in pursuit of understanding that world. Paradoxes arise whenever we press against the boundaries of our conceptual abilities, when we're trying to understand the nature of our conceptually structured thought, or when we're trying to understand the nature of our consciousness. If we press too hard, we get ourselves into a self-referential paradox. To explore those paradoxes, though, is to explore the boundaries. The better we understand the boundaries of our conceptual abilities, our cognitive abilities, the better we can come to understand the nature of our conceptual thought and the nature of our consciousness. Acknowledging and understanding our conceptual boundaries extends our conceptual reach. It doesn't limit it. It extends that reach, actually. It absolves us of duties that we cannot fulfill. And it allows us to value in some competing and seemingly mutually exclusive perspectives. On the one hand, concepts are like this. On the other hand, concepts are like that. On the one hand, consciousness is like this. On the other hand, consciousness is like that. We don't have to reconcile these seemingly competing perspectives, because that would require conceptual abilities, cognitive abilities that we do not actually possess. So you might wonder, if you wanted to hold on to this idea that we can provide a complete account of concepts or of consciousness, you might say, well, why not start with a notion of concepts as non-representational abilities, perhaps for Ruth Milligan, the ability to form representations, and derive concepts as representations. And likewise, why not start with consciousness as a non-reflective, very minimal state, maybe even something that we can implement in a machine today, and then derive the higher order reflective levels of consciousness. Likewise, you might ask, well, why not start with first order concepts? First order concepts are concepts of things in the world rather than concepts of other concepts. Why not start concepts and derive second and higher order concepts? Likewise with theories of consciousness. Start with first order consciousness, which is only directed to the world, and then derive and higher order consciousness, thoughts about thoughts and thoughts about thoughts about thoughts. And finally, putting these questions a third way, why not start with concepts as fundamentally public entities and derive concepts as private entities that can vary from one individual to another? Likewise, why not start with consciousness as a fundamental private entity and then try to work out how, at least in certain circumstances, we can try to share it? Problem with all of these strategies, and the reason that I don't think that any of them can work, can be expressed like this, and it's the problem of what I call the ineliminable. So when science does science, it the observer into the background. It thinks to remove the observer altogether, but in fact, there's no reason to think that we can actually do that. So what I'm calling into question here is the strict objectivity of science and scientific methods. Science is always conducted in a particular cultural and historical context. It is inevitably biased both by our individual perspectives as individual researchers, but also, and rather more insidiously perhaps, our collective biases as a community and as a society and as a human species at our current stage of development. So we always have these conceptual biases shaping our understanding of the world, shaping our understanding of ourselves, understanding of our own concepts and our own consciousness. So putting it one way, the problem here is that of, as I say, what I call the ineliminable. Expressed another way, the problem is the problem of experience and its habit of mixing the seemingly objective with the unavoidably subjective and intersubjective. And here I want to take a page from the later Edmund Husserl, for whom the subjective experience and the objective world were inextricably with each other, such that they could not really be pulled apart. We can pretend to, we cannot actually do so. So the bottom line of all of this, and something that we're going to be talking about more in the weeks ahead, when we talk about Dave Chalmers and his hard problem, when we talk about the mysterious, the bottom line, I believe, is that experience must be taken as foundational. We cannot set our phenomenal experience aside. We have to assume that phenomenal experience and derive our theory from there. That is to limit how much we can ultimately say about the ultimate nature of our concepts or our consciousness. So there's a quote that I like from Dave Chalmers in his 95 paper, Facing Up to the Hard Problem of Consciousness. He writes, "The really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does." I want to slightly transform that quote and put to you what I call the hard problem of concepts. The really hard problem of concepts, the problem of experience. How does physical processing give rise to the richly structured conceptual thought that structures experience? It seems logically it must do so somehow, but the moment we try to see how conceptually structured experience intrudes. So what Chalmers, I think, comes very close to acknowledging in that paper and in his subsequent writings, without ever really acknowledging, is that by his own way taking experience as something foundational, he is ultimately putting phenomenal experience beyond the possibility of explanation. It's an axiom, like axioms in mathematics. It's something that we assume in order to prove other things with it. It's not something that we can explore in any detail itself. We have to assume our phenomenal experience in order to give an explanation to consciousness, in order to give an explanation to the conceptually structured thought. So our consciousness and our conceptually structured thought pose a kind of jigsaw puzzle, and we're given, if you will, a box of pieces in this jigsaw puzzle, and we have to somehow fit all of the pieces together to make some kind of picture. Can be kept because we are, like the blind man and the elephant, unable to take in the entire picture at one time. When it comes to concepts specifically, I'm going to suggest 4 main types of puzzle pieces that we need to sort out. One is self-reference, another is simplification. The third one is what I referred to before as necessary fictions. A fourth is what I referred to as paradox. And all of these puzzle pieces apply to the nature of our consciousness as well. So, self-reference first. Theorizing about concepts is not only necessarily a reflective activity by an experiencing agent, it's self-referential in a way that raises certain logical difficulties. I conclude that this self-reference is, despite appearances, a distorting self-reference. When we reflect on the nature of our consciousness, what we are seeing cannot be our consciousness itself. If it were, then we would catch ourselves in an infinite regress. So what we're seeing when we look at our consciousness is some kind of a distorted mirror image. Simplification, the second piece of the puzzle. So when our concept structure experience is simplified in such a way that any original content is lost. I mentioned this notion before of necessary fictions. So the illusion provided by concepts is that in general, the original content of the world is not lost. Concept pulls from reference, though, only when we reflect on the matter, but the reflection is not itself the non-reflective use. That all is sounding rather complicated, but the point is that when we just get on with and employing our concepts non-reflectively, we're not making any distinction, operational distinction between the concept and the referent. They're just flowing together. And that is what I think we need to take as the ultimate reality for us. Our conceptually structured understandings of the world and the world itself do not, for us, pull apart. When we say anything objectively about the world, we necessarily do so from a certain conceptually biased perspective. So I've talked about self-reference, simplification, necessary fictions, finally paradox. Experience places certain limitations on our conceptual inability by our inability to set that experience, that phenomenal experience aside. Attempting to do so anyway, or failing to acknowledge the points that I've just made above, lead you into self-referential paradoxes, which can confuse the most intelligent and respected of researchers, never mind students. A quote here from Ambrose Bierce, who was a 19th century American writer. In his so-called Devil's Dictionary, he defines mind as, quote, a mysterious form of matter secreted by the brain. Its chief activity consists in the endeavor to ascertain its own nature, the futility of the attempt due to the fact that it has nothing but itself to know itself. And in complement to that, a quote from Zoltan Torrey, who's an American psychologist, also, I believe, gently blind. When the mind's focus is the focusing when the mind's focus is the focusing mind, new problems arise. The object, the instrument of the inquiry become one, and logic compromised. The mind is unable to decode itself or find its identity. Now, the interesting thing is that Zori thinks that that's not a problem, and we can get at the exact and true nature of the mind-independent world, whereas I'm going to argue, in keeping with people like Douglas Hofstadter, that in fact we cannot do that. And that our cognitive limitations and our conceptual limitations limit how we understand not just our own minds, but also how we understand the world around us. So, okay, I'm talking fairly interchangeably here about theories of concepts and theories of consciousness. My own research focus during my doctoral studies and in the 4.5 years have been on theories of concepts within philosophy of mind. As with consciousness studies, theories of concepts take empirical study of the world, the usual domain of science, and turn it around to focus attention on ourselves. And not just any aspect of ourselves, but that aspect that seems most essential to making us who we are, our minds. Theories of concepts are always put forth within a pre-existing conceptual structure, which they then hold. The heart of the problem is the threat of vicious or merely pernicious circularity, an endlessly receding target, self-referential paradox. So there is a picture, actually many pictures you can find on the internet with camera feedback. If you point a camera at a camera monitor, you get an seemingly infinitely receding series of images, one within another, within another, within another. That is, I think, the best way of understanding what happens if we try to press too hard our understanding of our conceptual nature or of our consciousness. It's like pointing the camera directly at the monitor. You get an infinitely receding series of images, and then if you point it directly at it, you get just some pretty random images that you can't interpret at all. That's talking about self-reference and a bit about paradox. Talking a bit more about concepts as simplification. So I said that concepts simplify the world by way of attempting to understand that world. A quote I want to read here from Peter Jerdenfors, whose book Conceptual Space has been very influential for me, both with my doctoral thesis and in my research since then. Jerdenfors writes in his book Conceptual Spaces that the prime problem is information by the receptors, the perceptual receptors, the sensory receptors, is too rich and too structured. What is needed is some way of transforming and organizing the input into a mode that can be handled on the conceptual or symbolic level. This involves finding a more economic form of representation. Going from the subconceptual to the conceptual level usually involves a reduction of the number of dimensions that are represented, hence distortion, hence you don't end up with what you started with. I want to say a little bit more about concepts as presenting necessities about the world. Concepts are things that we recognize, or we can recognize, I think, as logically they can't be quite true. We cannot do without them. We cannot, as conceptual agents, our conceptual nature, and just react in a non-conceptual fashion to the world around us. Lower organisms that lack conceptually structured thought can do this. They're essentially those stimulus response mechanisms. They're automata, essentially. Give them a certain stimulus, they're going to respond in a certain way. As conceptual agents, we're able to do something more. But at the same time, our concepts are, as I say, presenting a distorted view of the world around us. So and concepts are things that we should be able to recognize logically cannot be quite true. At the same time, we cannot do without them. When the ultimate truth outstrips our capacity for understanding, I believe it must do, And when we recognize that, as I believe we ought to do, then necessary fictions, as much as we may not like them, need to suffice. So necessary fictions enable us to understand the world at the same time that they distance us from it, at the same time that they remove us from that world. There are three key fictions in particular. So the first is that the world is the world. Perception is, at least for the most part, transparent. Our sensory modalities deliver the world to us as it is. The second fiction is that concepts and what they're about reliably and unproblematically pull apart from each other. And the third is that the world is not continuous, but is organized in discrete categories with neatly defined boundaries. And what that means is not only that the world is a continuous thing, but we as beings, as things in that world, we ourselves are continuous with that world. So we see a sharp boundary between ourselves and the world, or between ourselves and each other. I want to suggest to you that that sharp boundary is actually a conceptually imposed boundary, and that we ought to see the underlying reality as being more continuity between ourselves and our physical environment, between ourselves and our social environment, between ourselves and the people around us. So finally, a little bit more about the nature of paradox, in particular self-referential paradox, which I think arises when we try to push our understanding of concepts or consciousness too hard. We can describe self-referential paradox as any set of circumstances that one has equally valid and compelling grounds for concluding both a proposition P and its negation not P. It is impossible to choose between them without deriving a contradiction. One of the most famous paradoxes historically is Epimenides' paradox. Epimenides said that all Cretans are liars. Of course, Epimenides was himself a Cretan. Epimenides may as well have been saying, I am a liar, or simply, I am lying. We cannot interpret that in any without ending up in a contradiction. Therefore, Epimenides presents us with a paradox. Paradoxes arise when you push the necessary fictions presented by concepts too far. So one ends up either with an eternally receding target as we try to understand ourselves, understanding ourselves, like the camera focused on the camera monitor, or we end up with an eternal flip-flop between two mutually exclusive perspectives. So in the case of Epimenides' paradox, he's telling the truth, he must be lying. He's telling the truth, he must be lying. Can't hide what is the case without ending up in a contradiction. Quote here from Gedel Bach by Hofstadter. Excellent book, came out in 1979. It has to be one of the most published and widely read works in philosophy of mind and philosophy of consciousness. Truly an outstanding achievement, and one that was deeply influential to me back to my undergraduate days. Hofstadter writes in Gedel Bach, Epimenides' paradox is a statement that rudely violates the usually assumed dichotomy of statements into true and false. Because if you tentatively think it is true, then it immediately backfires on you and makes you think it is false. But once you've decided it is false, a similar backfiring returns you to the idea that it must be true. So we're in an eternal oscillation between two opposing positions that we cannot decide between, both of which we need. That I want to is the nature of our concepts, that's the nature of our consciousness, that's the nature of understanding of the world itself. So the position that I've called perspectival dualism, the idea that mind and physical reality are not two different substances, neither are they two different sets of properties of the same substance. Rather, mind and physical reality are two perspectives that we take on one and the same world. When we're taking the mind perspective, then our own subjective and our intersubjective perspective and bias is very much front and center, the observer is front and center. When we're taking the physical perspective, then we're pushing the observer into the background or ignoring the observer. We actually need both perspectives in order to have anything like a complete understanding of the world around us, even though we cannot reconcile those two perspectives into one single, coherent, correct perspective. What I call perspectival dualism. A quote here, another quote from Zoltan Torey, the Crucible of Consciousness, a similar idea of oscillation. He writes, between these two competing perspectives, I take an object and just by focusing on it, noticed almost at once that it, the content component, begins to recede and becomes overlaid by the sensation that the whole experience is our own doing. However, the same sense of self-contribution, too, begins at once to fade, allowing the attention to swing back once more to the object in focus. From there to fade in turn, accentuating the self-sensation once more before the attentional pendulum swings back to the object again. We cannot decide between these two perspectives on the world, both perspectives, in order to have anything like a complete perspective on the world, on ourselves, on our consciousness, on the nature of our conceptually structured thought. So reflecting on our reflections to get at the actual facts of the matter about the nature of our consciousness or our concepts presents us with an endlessly receding target, like focused on its monitor. Reflecting on what must be going on when we are not reflecting on what is going on presents us with an endless oscillation between two competing perspectives. One ends up with a kind of inconsistency, but it's inconsistency. We have an inability to decide which perspective is the right one, precisely because both perspectives are right and both perspectives are at the same time wrong because they're incomplete. So there is a distinction to be made very importantly in the case of either our concepts or our consciousness, between our concepts as we possess and employ them non-reflectively and concepts as we reflect upon them, between our consciousness using interaction with the world and our consciousness as something that we reflect on when we're conscious of our own consciousness. So that latter distinction between our consciousness of our own consciousness and consciousness is one that the phenomenologists are very keen to make. I'm thinking in particular of Sean Gallagher with an article that is found elsewhere in the Blackwell Companion to Consciousness. Sean talks about the importance of distinguishing what he calls pre-reflective self-consciousness, reflective self-consciousness. So the pre-reflective self-consciousness is the bare consciousness, the consciousness without being conscious of being consciousness. the same sort of distinction, I think, needs to be made for concepts. So there's an important distinction to be made between concepts we reflect upon, in which case they just present themselves to us as something like mental representations, and concepts as things that we just get on with possessing and employing non-reflectively without thinking about them, which must be what we're doing most of the time. And we can hash out this distinction as well between concepts as something that are intentionally imposed top-down when we choose to structure our understanding of the world in a certain way, and concepts from the bottom up as something delivered to us by experience. We can likewise cash out the difference as one between concepts as the product of rational thought, or what is the philosophy of mind, and concepts as the product of empirical discovery, or what's called the concept empiricist tradition in philosophy of mind. We can distinguish between concepts as objects of perception on the one hand, and as the means of perceiving objects on the other, being conscious, accessible things on the one hand, and partly or substantially not consciously accessible to us on the other. Concepts as knowledge that on the one hand. My concept of a bicycle includes the knowledge that I put my feet on the pedals and move them in a certain way, the bicycle will move forward. But we can talk about concepts as knowledge how. So much of my knowledge of riding a bicycle cannot be stated in propositional form. I just know how to do it. I just know how to forget how to fall off. So concepts are both knowledge that in a certain way, and they are knowledge how to do something. Concepts, likewise, are both symbolic entities, like words of a language. Language is paradigmatic. At the same time, concepts are skillful abilities to engage with the world. And finally, concepts are both mental representations, and they're the abilities to form representations. Actually, I've got a few more of these here. Concepts as subpropositional components of thought on the one hand, concepts as subconscious components of interaction on the other, concepts as abstract and mental on the one hand, concepts as concrete on the other, abstracted from context on the one hand, sensitive to context on the other, internal to the agent on the one hand, external to the agent and ultimately located in the environment on the other, static things on the one hand, dynamic on the other, discrete, individual things on the one hand, continuous on the other, easily tied to language, clearly distinguishable from language, private entities, public entities. I could really go on and on with this. The idea that there are these two fundamental perspectives, that competing perspectives that we can take on the nature of our conceptually structured thought, on the nature of our consciousness, on the nature of the world itself. And we can derive a whole long series of competing conclusions based on them. So the take-home messages that I want you to take away from this lecture today, it is successfully recording, I'm hoping it is. First, it's that acknowledging the boundedness of conceptual understanding is not the same as throwing up our hands and saying we can't explain consciousness. That would be Mysterianism. I am not a Mysterianist. I believe we can explain consciousness much better than we have so far. I do not, however, believe that we can ever give a complete and consistent, a final answer to what consciousness is. Sciences of concepts and sciences of consciousness remind us all, or they should remind us all, of what we should have remembered all along, namely that the observer is always present, even if in the background. Nature of our experience is inextricably bound up with the objective world. Science yields not timeless understandings freed from cultural and historical contexts, but working hypotheses that are very much embedded in cultural and historical contexts. And truth itself is, in fact, a work in progress. And the final mental image that I want to leave you with is that of the dragon swallowing its own tail. That's what we get ourselves into when we try to understand the nature of conceptually structured thought, the nature of consciousness. So this module over the next few weeks is going to be talking about the limitations, if any, to how much we can understand our consciousness, the arguments against any such limitations, and if we accept those limitations, what the consequences and as I have tried to argue a little bit here today, accepting that we do have limitations on the nature of our cognition, the nature of our conceptually structured thought, don't limit us so much as they actually open up possibilities for us to understand ourselves better. So thank you very much, and I look forward to doing another talk, hopefully with a little bit less on the technical problem side and a little bit more smoothness with the delivery. Thank you very much.